Welcome, wizards, to the Starlit Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Stella Marie, and I am a bit like a bridge between people seeking wisdom and those that have it within the realms of Celtic spirituality, connecting to the spiritual life and beliefs of the ancestors within Celtic lands. This particular episode, we're dissecting why Celtic spirituality isn't the right term, why it's problematic, what it really means, and where to go from there. Let's ride this whimsical wave right into the wisdom that we need to discover today. Hello everyone, and welcome to my first interview and podcast of 2024. I have had podcasts in the past and I didn't plan that I'd be starting one this early, but I've had such a demand in terms of questions surrounding the topics I talk about on my social media platforms. And today I have got someone with me, Sam, who runs a project. I guess it's a project called the Pretani Wisdom Traditions. And Pretani is a word that we're going to go into, and it sounds similar to Britain, Pretani, and there's a reason for that. We're going to go into that. So yeah, Sam is the co-founder of Pretani Wisdom Traditions. She has a BA in Celtic Studies, and she specialises in training people to reawaken their own seership abilities, to rekindle their natural relationships with the land and all its other than human persons, to heal themselves and to live in tune with the rhythms and cycles of life in a way that allows each person to become a sovereign being. So, hello Sam, welcome to this chat. Bore da, good morning. Thank you so much for coming and chatting to me. You're very much with what you talk about and what you do kind of encompasses so many different aspects of what people have been asking me about, which is why I've brought you here. And we spoke before about the questions I was going to ask you so that you could come prepared with the answers. And I think with this sort of conversation around wisdom traditions from where we're from, Pretani or Britain, Ireland, these Celtic lands, it is important to have some sort of structure around how we're giving the historical information because it is so complex. So I'm going to go through a few questions with Sam, and they're going to go in this order. And I'm just saying this for people listening so that you can just be aware of what we're going to be talking about. So we're first going to go into the problems and how the term Celtic spirituality is problematic in itself. We're going to go through misconceptions around Celtic spirituality. And then we're going to dive into who are the Pretani, what is Pretani, and then into animism, what is animism. And I've structured this in this way, so I'm hoping it will all flow and make sense. And I just wanted to say, Sam, did you want to introduce yourself at all or say what you're doing at the moment, or would you like to just dive in to the first question? It's completely up to you.
Well, I think you gave me a pretty good introduction there, but I do want to say also that, since graduating, I've kind of found a really deep interest in sort of pre-Christian ritual and religion, which is something that I'm kind of exploring, and into that comes this whole animistic principle, which is what I'm working with at the moment. But aside from that, let's just get to it.
Yeah. So Celtic spirituality is a very much like how I'll just kind of say what I feel about it. It's an umbrella term for a modern way of approaching something that didn't really exist as a Celtic spirituality. And it's very complex, but it is kind of like a gateway into learning some truth around what Celtic spirituality could have been. There isn't really one description, but why isn't there one description, and why is this term so problematic while at the same time so attractive for people?
So, as you say, it's an extremely complex situation, and also quite thorny in some ways. But so I'm going to try my best to navigate this as simply as possible. But one thing I'd like to say at the outset is that some of the things that I'm going to say might be challenging to some people. But for me, the pursuit of knowledge is important in relation to our past. And prior to going and studying all this at uni, I was laboring under, the same misconceptions because I had no other information apart from what was available in Neopagan literature. So all I would say is that I just ask people to listen with an open mind, and ultimately they can make their own decisions after they've heard the evidence. Okay. So I think the first question that we need to address is exactly what is meant by the term Celtic spirituality. So what are we talking about exactly? And to me, the term seems very, very vague, but as you pointed out, is closely connected to modern Celtic paganism, modern Druidry, as which we've both identified on Instagram, have very little or no connection to authentic pre-Christian practices, because the information is just not available to us. So the mythology that does survive is medieval, and in many cases represents medieval Christian worldviews, an opinion that some diehard Celtic pagans find extremely upsetting, but it's a fact. Most of the myths that we have preserved were recorded in writing between sort of like the 8th and 9th to the 15th centuries. And sure, they may have originated from earlier oral traditions, but they also might not. So, for example, the Irish and Welsh deities only appear in the later medieval mythology. So, for example, like the Welsh Mabinogi, the stories that describe things like the goddess Rhiannon, the realm of Arawn, and various other otherworldly tales, wasn't written until around 1300. And scholars have determined that the stories themselves seem to date no further back than the 11th century. So that's over 1,000 years after the so-called Celts were roaming the land. And we also need to remember that medieval scribes were quite imaginative in their writings, because books were one of the only forms of entertainment, aside from, feasting and music, for more aristocratic levels of society. So the stories need to be engaging, shocking, romantic, and entertaining. So I guess you can see the problem there, yeah?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with someone yesterday, and it was what I'd call the first kind of debate with someone where they were quite ignorant um towards the truth of this history, where they are interested in Germanic deities, and they asked me if I believed in the Welsh gods and goddesses. And I said it's a tricky topic because we didn't actually have gods and goddesses or deities. And he went on to Google, typed in Welsh gods and goddesses, and said, yes, you do. Here's a list. Here are books about it. Cerridwen, Rhiannon, Bran. And I said, these are characters from a story written, as he said, in the 11th and 12th century. And this is one of those, misconceptions where I think people will ask Google a question and they will be presented something and not look further. And it offended me a little bit because this is my history and I'm here interviewing people like you. And I've sent him your page and I've sent them my friend, well, someone I know, Gwilym Morris Bard, who is
Oh, yeah.
yeah, he's like the kind of the guy with the wisdom around the Welsh traditions.
Sure.
And he calls himself Celtic sources, but through everything he's talking about, he is describing how they're not, because he talks about the Mabinogi and these myths from that time, and he says they're from this period of the 11th to 15th century. But he says he's using the term Celtic sources because it's what draws people in and it's what people know of today. And that's why I also have in my Instagram bio Celtic in paganism, because it's just the doorway into this wisdom. where this conversation, you can kind of clear up why that is a doorway, but why it's going to lead you to somewhere you don't expect it to lead you.
Yeah, quite. And we're going to discuss later the fact that Celtic wasn't actually a term used by the inhabitants of the British Isles until the 18th century. So, in itself, the term's problematic. But I think the point that I really want to emphasize around all this is that Celtic isn't a one size fits all descriptor. Okay, there's so many variables across the British and Irish traditions that we can't realistically boil everything down into an umbrella Celtic spirituality. And I don't believe that we should. In fact, I find the term Celtic increasingly redundant. It's actually a useless term in the sense that we don't need it to identify ourselves as non-Anglo-Saxon English because we already have our current identifiers. You're Cymru, I'm a Scot, for example. So we don't actually need the word Celtic to define our ethnicity. And calling somebody a Celt is the same as saying like the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, the Manx, the Cornish, and the Bretons are the same people. Mm. And these people would disagree with that. And so it's a reductionist and inaccurate term.
Yeah, I agree. But one thing I have found in it's where I still like to use the word, especially people from America who have got ancestry that does spread out across the Celtic lands, it gives them a chance to connect in some way to something that without that word they wouldn't be able to connect and their path would be different. So it's difficult because it's a doorway towards deeper truths. And I think if people are truly open to whatever their spiritual path is, then they can open more doors past that one door into Celtic spirituality and avoid the ignorance, because otherwise there is delusion. People are believing in a history that didn't exist, and that takes away from the spiritual path. But there's also benefit in it because of a lot of people are truly connecting to their heritage through the term. So it's sticky. It's very sticky.
It is sticky, and I do agree with you. I think, and I was talking to another friend about this who's doing the same kind of work, and she said, it's a gateway. It is a gateway term for people because most people can understand from a general point and perspective what it actually means. But just sort of diving back into this idea of misconception, I think it's important for us to keep our surviving folkloric practices congruent with their place of origin. Otherwise, this is where the waters start to get muddied. So, for example, I guess like the folkloric practices of Brittany, which is a traditionally Celtic country, are completely different to the practices of Ireland or Wales, for example. But by lumping them under a Celtic umbrella label, it can lead people to believe that Breton practices were part of British and Irish traditions. And it's quite possible that originally they were similar to Cornish traditions, as Brittany was populated by migrants from the southwest during the Roman occupation. But by the time Britain becomes divided into separate countries, any connection to Breton practices are well and truly lost. So Celtic spirituality, when you examine it deeply, loses its meaning for me. And I think, it's more useful for us to think in terms of like Welsh spirituality, Welsh animism, Scottish spirituality, Irish, and so on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. This is something that I love to talk about, the differences between us all, especially because I remember speaking to people online, and whenever I'd say I'm from Wales, I would be met with, "Oh, is that in England? No. Is that by London? No." A lot of people don't even know what Wales is. So I love to talk about it to share where I'm from. But there's something also in me like maybe we're meant to be hiding. Maybe the world isn't meant to know. But I've got past that now. The world needs to know. Especially people who do have ancestry here. I've had quite a lot of people message me saying thank you so much for sharing just pictures of where you're from because their nan was from here or something. There was a lady whose who's come here to spread her mum's ashes in a town that's not far from here, from America, and she only was here for 2 days. And it's just those deep, beautiful connections that have come through me speaking about this. That's just like, this is why I'm doing it. The ancestral connection through the online sphere is just incredible. So, do you have three specific misconceptions around Celtic spirituality that are quite prominent in this neo-pagan world?
Absolutely, and this is where I make myself wildly unpopular. Okay, but here we go. So the first one is the Celtic tree calendar. So the Celtic tree calendar purports to be the representation of the changing year referencing trees instead of months. Okay, so the changing of the trees being linked to a lunar cycle of 28 days. So this means that there's like 13 trees in the year rather than the regular Roman 12. And the presumption is that this method's an ancient representation of marking the passage of time. But the tree calendar is a modern interpretation of something different. So in 1946, a novelist and poet called Robert Graves wrote his so-called study on Celtic mythology, The White Goddess. Yeah. And it was published 2 years later in 1948. So Graves borrowed the idea of the early medieval Irish Ogham alphabet, as some of the Ogham characters were believed to be based on trees, and rearranged it to suit his own invention of the Celtic tree calendar, naming 13 months after trees. But the Ogham alphabet itself dates from like the 5th and 6th centuries, and all it is a form of lettering, a form of writing, originating in Ireland, that's nearly always found carved on monumental stones referencing the names of the person buried there, or perhaps a local land spirit. That's all it is. It's a modern neo-pagan invention.
I found out about the Ogham alphabet, and it was introduced to me in a book saying that they were Welsh runes.
No.
Are they?
No.
Have they got anything to do with divination or trees in Wales?
No. So basically, it is an Irish system, early Irish system of writing. Okay. And we know that the Irish came and settled in certain parts of Wales for a short period of time in the early medieval period. So this is why you see Ogham inscriptions appearing in sort of like areas of Wales. It's because of the Irish settlers, not because it was anything to do with Welsh runic symbols. And we have no evidence whatsoever that exists that Ogham was ever used as any kind of form of divination. Okay, there are actually only a few of the letters which correspond to trees, so maybe about 7 or 8 of them. The rest of them mean something completely different. So, and it was Graves that kind of took an idea and ran with it, essentially, and it is historically inaccurate.
Cool. It would have been cool if they were.
Of course it would. But what I want to say is, just because it doesn't exist as an ancient form of divination doesn't mean that it doesn't work as a form of divination today. Because any oracle that we use, it works because of the intention that we put into it. So of course they're going to work as a system.
That's my experience. I had some profound experiences with the divination of Ogham, and not because of my ancestors had created this runic divination practice. It's because, as you said, it's the intention we put into that magical tool.
Yes.
And yes. I have had some very profound, teachings through the Ogham where they have, from this one book that had this one description of this one tree that just represented the moment in time that I was in. I was asking it, what is going to happen with divination, and that did happen. And it's not because of the ancient tradition of Ogham, because that's not real. It's because of the magic that we hold as individuals, which is, we will go into it a little bit at the end when we talk about animism, but your practice as a seer and your practice, like you as bridging the ancient wisdom of myths of the British Isles to create a path that's suitable for right now, and so that we are able to use it kind of as inspiration, but we're forging our own path. So
Mm.
yeah, it's not to say that you can't use this as a divination tool for anyone listening, but it's not an accurate description of what the Welsh or Irish ancestors would have used them for.
No, quite so. And if you're interested, I can send you there's a journal paper by a chap called Damien McManus, who is like one of the foremost experts on the Irish organ, and it'll give you a full breakdown of the organ kennings, the meanings, and you'll be able to see for yourself what they actually represent. If so, I'm happy to share that with you if you like.
Yeah, lovely. I'll pop it in the description of this podcast. If you can think of any resources you think would be valuable, I'll do that. So what would
Mm-hmm.
another misconception around Celtic spirituality be?
Okay, so another one of mine is the four elements. Okay, so the incorporation of the four elements of earth, air, fire, water into modern pagan practice in Britain is again traced back to the mid 20th century and the emergence of modern pagan, neo-pagan movements. The concepts of the four elements have ancient roots, right enough, which can be found in various ancient cultures and philosophies, but most notably those of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians. However, the modern adoption and integration of the four elements into pagan practice in Britain and other Western countries only emerged within the context of the revival of interest in nature-based spirituality and pagan beliefs during the sort of mid to later 20th century. So I think one significant figure we associate with the popularization of the four elements is a chap called Gerald Gardner.
Mm.
He's often referred to as the father of Wicca, this modern pagan religion that draws inspiration from various Celtic, pre-Christian, and occult traditions. So, roughly from the 1940s onwards, Gardner played a crucial role in the public emergence and promotion of Wicca, which incorporated elemental symbolism into its rituals and practices. So, again, yes, it's not indigenous to our belief system. And when we look at the surviving mythology, I think there's one reference. There's one reference in the Book of Taliesin, okay, the Welsh Book of Taliesin, in a poem called "The Battle of the Trees," where the line runs something like, "Of the 9 elements I am created." Not 4, of the 9. And so a little bit of research into sort of Indo-European traditions. We see this idea of 9 elements popping up quite frequently in sort of the much earlier traditions. So the 9 elements, they are generally considered to be rock, earth, plants, water, wind, clouds, sun, moon, sky. And
Wow.
those are the elements that I work with.
I've not heard of that before, but that,
Mm-hmm.
yes, yeah. I love that. I something in me feels that for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And is
Yeah.
that what you go, that's obviously what you go into then in your workshops and your courses on the elements of the Pretani.
Well, working with the 9 elements is about as close to an animistic practice as you can actually get when you start diving deep, because you can liken the 9 elements to various systems in the body.
Mm.
So if you think about the rocks are our bones, the earth is our muscle and skin, the plants is our hair. Yeah, the waters are the blood that courses through the veins, the wind is the breath, clouds is the thoughts, sun is the right eye, moon is the left eye, and it's like the mind is the sky.
Wow. I love that. I've not heard of that before. That
Yeah,
is,
so I teach a lot of that kind of meditation, and when you actually go into that, you suddenly become the earth, and that's the best way for me to describe it. There ceases to be this disconnection, this division between me and the land.
mm. beautiful. Like, I'm so excited to take that course. I'm so excited to learn more about that, but we'll put a pin in that for people if you want to learn more. There's going to be more to come. So we've had the tree calendar isn't quite what the Neopagan movement says it is. That's something that I heard of, and I came out of the New Age spiritual movement into this sort of information, and I was like, yeah, we have a tree calendar, we have this, this, and this, and then like slowly was
Same.
like, oh, okay, we don't. But now you're sharing that with the elements. I thought that we had the four elements, but now you're so I was disappointed that we didn't. I don't have to be disappointed that we don't have the four elements because we have something different. Um, that's really cool. Yeah. So we've had the tree calendar, the Celtic tree calendar didn't exist. There were not four elements within the Celtic world that existed as a spiritual tradition. What would be the third misconception and the last that we're going to talk about?
So I guess this is like the last and perhaps one of the biggest ones, because it's one that is going to cause quite a bit of consternation among modern pagans. And this is the maiden mother crone triple goddess figure. Right. So this is going to take a little bit of detangling, so bear with. So, but again, our friend Robert Graves is to blame for this one. So the maiden mother crone archetype originates with him in the white goddess. And he claimed that this overarching goddess figure, tripartite structure, was present everywhere in Celtic and British mythology, but its assumptions are not supported by evidence. We have scholars like Ronald Hutton who've argued that there is no evidence in existing sources for a uniform triple goddess archetype. The maiden mother crone categories are not present in British folklore. So we have figures like Bridget and Morrigan in the Irish tradition, which have complex, multifaceted roles, but none of them fit neatly into those three aspects. Like Bridget, for example, is one of the most revered Irish goddesses. She's associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft, okay, seemingly disparate areas that show her multifaceted nature. She's linked to hearth and home, but also to wisdom and war as well. So she defies that characterization as just a young maiden or old woman. And then you have the Morrigan, for example. She's portrayed as this fierce battle goddess in Irish legend, appearing as a crow or a raven. But she also appears as a protective mother-like figure, nurturing the hero Cuchulainn. She shifts her shape from old woman to young seductress in different stories. And both Bridget and Morrigan have domains that blend domestic and martial. They hold power over life, death, and fate. The stories show them initiating sexual relationships rather than being passive objects of desire like the traditional maiden. So neither goddess fits neatly into the stage of motherhood either. The Morrigan appears to challenge maternal stereotypes as a dangerous destroyer at times. And Bridget is associated with poetry and craft, not motherhood. And they also both define the crone aspect as solely post-menopausal women. The Morrigan's dangerous sexuality and Bridget's hearth domain connect them to a more regenerative, sort of powerful womanhood beyond childbearing years. So what people now think, what the scholars now think, is that the maiden mother crone concept imposes modern preconceptions of female life stages onto ancient myth and folklore in a very oversimplified and reductionist way. So it's sort of like projecting contemporary assumptions about women, about aging, about gender roles onto past societies and belief systems, which actually don't have any basis in fact. So, it's a projection of feminine experience by predominantly male scholars from the early 20th century, historical women, rather than reflecting the actual content of British and European mythology. So, in short, the scholarly analysis finds that the triple goddess concept is completely flawed and inaccurate. It just didn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a projection. A lot of this is a projection. Um, Very similar to how what we know of different little tangent, but not quite because it relates, but how what we know of the Druids and how people practice Druidry is a political projection from people who had political agendas in the past. And it's similar, but perhaps, it wasn't a political projection of the Maiden Mother and Crone, but it's interesting that you said that it is men talking
Mm.
about the path of a woman, and I can relate to those three individual archetypes within myself, but that doesn't mean it's got anything to do with the past. And again, it's okay for us as individuals to work with these archetypes within us, but it's just not right to ignore the facts around history that you're sharing. Um, yeah, and it's really it's related to the moon as well, isn't it? Like the moon goes through these stages and the woman goes through these stages. And there are things that connect these things, but not to the Celtic pastoral people. Um, and yeah, the complexities, like even talking about this by saying the Celtic people, if you hadn't already listened to the beginning of this podcast where we've digested how that terminology doesn't work in itself, I feel like sometimes I have to say like repetitively explain that before using the word Celtic, and it's hard to know what word to use. So I'll move on to the next. I've been looking for a word to use because a lot of the debates and controversy on my Instagram have come from the terminology I used to describe these things. And it started off with, because I didn't understand how complex this was when I started talking about this online, it started off with people saying that the political uses of the terms UK and Britain, when I'm also discussing Ireland, even if I separate Ireland, there's a lot of stickiness there. Then using the term Celtic to describe practices in Britain and Ireland, it just doesn't make sense because it's not there. And then I'm like, well, then what do I do to talk about this? Because I'm trying to reach people around the world, and the only words that they know to connect to what I could be talking about are Britain and Celtic. Because as I said, a lot of people don't even know Wales existed. So I'm a bit like a bridge between the people who want to learn and then people like yourself who have the expertise. And hopefully people will walk along that bridge and, not turn their back. Because there is a greener side of the grass on the other side. No matter how disappointed you might get walking across that bridge, there is so much on the other side. So in terms of words that we can use, I'd never heard of the word Pretani until I came across your Instagram page and came across the Pretani Wisdom Traditions. So what is Pretani? Who are the Pretani? Who were the Pretani?
Okay, so little tiny plug now. So I've taken the information from this from my forthcoming book. So it's a little bit of a taster for you and for people. But what I want to say, first of all, is that it's important for people to understand that at this point, we're heading way back into history. So this is well before any ideas of Ireland or Scotland or Wales as separate political entities. Okay, so it's back to a time when the whole archipelago was populated by tribes that interacted with each other and existed with each other as natives of all the islands. Okay, so the term Pretani, and also spelt Pritani, so Pri, is the earliest recorded collective name for the Iron Age tribes who inhabited what is now known as the British Isles and Ireland in pre-Roman times. And the earliest known reference to the Pretani can be found in the work of the ancient Greek historian and geographer Herodotus. And he wrote about the peoples of the world in the 5th century BCE. So he mentioned a group called the Pretanoi, associated with the inhabitants of Britain. Then Pythias of Massalia also wrote about the Pretani in 325 BCE. And although his original work doesn't survive, he was quoted frequently by other classical authors based on his work. So the Roman writer Avienus referred to the large island of Britain as Albion and the smaller island as Iwerna. Okay. Do you speak Welsh at all?
Dwi'n trio, not much. I can literally speak the basics.
Okay, so the old name that he identified for Ireland was Iwerna, and the surviving Welsh word for Ireland is Iwertha. So so there we go. So the entire archipelago, he said, was called Pretanica. And the Roman historian Diodorus Siculus also mentioned the Pretani in his writings, referring to the people of the northern parts of the British Isles. And the name Pretanica was then Latinized into Britannica, and the Pretani thus became the Brittani and eventually Britons. Okay, so we see a linguistic survival of this in the name of the province of Brittany, for example, in northern France. The area was populated, as I said, by tribes of Pretani migrating from the southwest of Britain during the Roman occupation. And the name literally translates as Little Britain. So the modern Welsh name for the island is Prydain, suggesting that the original Brythonic P form from which modern Welsh evolves matched the Pretani of the early historians. And the Brittonic term for the Picts in the far north was Prytani. So the similarity between all of those forms is undeniable. And also the Pretani was believed to have been a broad and general label used by outsiders to refer to the various tribes which populated the British Isles. But some scholars, such as archaeology professor Barry Cunliffe, now believe that the name is likely to be native in origin. So in other words, what the people of the island called themselves. So therefore, the term Pretani predates Roman conquest of Britain. The people living in Britannica before Roman rule were part of a diverse tribal society with their own language, customs, and traditions. And despite the historical references, we have limited direct information available about them. Most of what is known about them comes from the classical authors, and these references are often brief and sometimes can be ambiguous. However, they offer this tantalizing evidence of our pre-Christian identity as distinct from continental Celts, suggesting, as the scholarship now indicates, that they were a separate culture and people. And Julius Caesar was another scribe who referred to the Celts as being people who specifically inhabited the areas of modern France and Spain and parts of Europe north of the Rhine. And he stated that these people were called Celts or Galli in his language. And he stated quite categorically that the people of Britain were tribal and mentions individual tribes, but these tribes are always collectively referred to as Britons and never Celts. And all of the surviving medieval literature refers to the inhabitants of Britain as Britons, not Celts. And in fact, there's no ancient word for Celt in the British indigenous languages. It only exists as a modern loan word. But, you know, the word Prydain in Welsh, meaning Britain, and Prydainwr and Brythoniaid both refer to Britons. And in Irish Gaelic, I think the word is Bradnach, with a similar sound in Scots Gaelic. And here's the clincher, right? This is a difficult one for people to accept, but the truth is that nobody in the British Isles ever referred to themselves as a Celt until 1707. And 1707 is an interesting time in history because I think it's when the Act of Union was proclaimed, you know, sort of bringing Scotland and Wales and all that into the idea of a united kingdom. But at that time, we have a Welsh Oxford academic, Edward Lloyd, publishing a publication called Archaeologia Britannica, in which he categorizes ancient British languages as Celtic based on what are now they're now considered questionable comparisons to modern Irish, Welsh, and Breton languages. And from this, he surmised that all the languages had a single Celtic root. Okay, a theory which has since come under scrutiny, not least because directly linking languages to ethnic groups is now seen as overly simplistic. His timeline wasn't precise. Celtic language spread peaked later in the Iron Age. His data was limited and relied far too heavily on the Greco-Roman accounts. And he was influenced, most notably, by desires to establish noble Celtic origins for British history. But at that point, in the 18th century, his work lent this kind of scholarly veneer to grouping these languages and cultures together under the umbrella Celtic term. And his influence established this concept as of an identifiable Celtic cultural identity inhabiting ancient Britain. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's funny how long it takes from someone to like me coming out of a very new age spiritual world, wanting to find some roots and belong at home, to find out that the Celtic period perhaps had this spiritual identity, to then to listen to what you're saying is just incredible. And as much as what I previously believed and what I previously thought was wrong, there is a truth to it. There is a history there. And although we don't, like, I'm from Cardiff, so I'm in South Wales, and the Silurian tribe were very, very well known as being quite a brutal and fierce tribe. And we have Welsh culture here still, but there's really nothing for me to connect to in comparison to other native and indigenous cultures around the world who also underwent a loss of their culture. And like even the river here, like the River Taff, the biggest river that comes from the Brecon, we don't even know what it originally was called. We just know a very recent name for it. And it was sad. Like I used to feel sad and I used to feel disappointed and I used to feel like there wasn't anything to connect to historically, because we don't have the same connections that they do up in North Wales, where you still have the ancient names of the rivers that tell the stories of how the people associated them with different animistic, which is what we'll move on to next, different animistic things. But I've really, it's like through this conversation and where you're talking about who the Pretani were, it's given me a word to use, and it's given me a name to use to describe this land that isn't like super political and it's not dividing. But still, if I am going to use it to describe this land, like the earth really is, like when I'm talking about Britain and Ireland, I'm talking about the earth here. I'm talking about the natural world here where there are no borders. And that's where I will be using that term Pretani to describe the natural world here, where there are separate cultures. So the Welsh culture, yes, is separate to the Cornish culture, is separate to the Anglo culture, is separate to the Irish culture. But I had this vision the other day, and it was on the border of England and Wales, and there was a leaf that floated from a tree over the border, and there was just silence, because there are no borders. And I had this vision while I was reading the arguments in my comment section between all of these people trying to argue about the geopolitical terms, and English arguing with Welsh, arguing with Irish, arguing with Scottish, and just missing my point, which is the natural world, the natural cycles, and the natural seasons, and the spirits that dwell within them do not care, unfortunately, about any of this. And that's what us who are trying to belong are wanting to connect to. So that's why I'm going to use the term Pretani, and hopefully over time, people will see why. Yeah, I'm glad you agree because it's a very new realization for me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree wholeheartedly. And I also, it's a useful term for me as well. Pretani is a useful term for me as an animist who is working, deeply with the ancestral memory of the land and the Iron Age ancestors. It's useful to have a term to use that they might recognize.
Mm,
Yeah, when I'm trying to communicate, that they might actually recognize and understand themselves to be, rather than Celts or whatever other terms that we apply. I mean, it's like,
yes.
the term Welsh is Anglo-Saxon origin, Wales, foreigner, where
Mm.
it's
Yeah,
yeah,
so using Pretani, yeah, I've not thought about that before, but that's profound. Using the term Pretani to speak to the earth and the ancestors and the spirits, because that is a term that would have been used to describe us, in which we described ourselves as. And as you just said, if people don't know, Wales, the word Wales it means foreigner. Originally, we are Cymru or Cymric,
mhm.
and prior to then, there wasn't a name because there wasn't a border in the first place. As I said, the leaf that silently floats over the border doesn't it silently floats over a tree or whatever it may be. There's no border. And while I was having this vision, I also had a vision of me and my friend Victoria doing like ley line work, but on the borders. And there's something that I'd like to do over the next few years, but I don't know what's there, but there was something, and it was just doing work to dismantle that border by being on the border and reminding the just connecting to the natural world. I don't know. There's something there that
Yeah, and I think you've got a great place to try and do that as well with Offers Dyke.
mm, yeah,
Offers Dyke is that old border, like literally a physical border as well, but put up by the Anglo-Saxons, wasn't it?
where's
Yeah,
that?
I think
Where's that now?
Offers Dyke. It's basically, if you look on the map, it runs from north to south Wales, and it's the old, I think, 7th century border that was
Yeah,
implemented by King Offa of the Anglo-Saxons.
yeah.
Basically to section Wales off from the rest of Saxon Britain.
Yeah, that's the board. Yeah, that's the border I'm talking about. I didn't know the term for it.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
studied in Hereford University, so I lived in Hereford for a few years, and even that area used to be Cymru. And there's like
Mm.
friends from Shropshire. And I spent a lot of time around those hills, and it's just funny how you can be on a hill, and then one town is in England and one town's in Wales, and it's just, yeah, it's just so
I
it's
think one of the things that fascinates me is like, the Welsh language, the Brythonic language. We see its survival all over the country. It's like, I lived in Yorkshire for a long time, and we've got a hill, hills there called Pen-y-Ghent. That's Brythonic. Like up in Scotland, you got Aberdeen. That's Brythonic. That's of Welsh origin. Aber, it's so we weren't separate.
no,
We were one sort of wonderful group of disparate tribes. And if you look at the Iron Age map that I know you've got, because you posted it on Instagram, if you look in what is now Yorkshire, you have the Brigantes tribe there, but you also have a tribe of Brigantes in Southern Ireland. So we know that they were all just one sort of tribal mishmash. And do you see what I'm saying? What I'm trying to say is like that is why Pretani is such a useful
yeah,
term, because it's all of us.
yeah. Oh wow, yeah.
Before any ideas of division and politics, and because Celticism developed in reaction to British colonialism and the cultural
Mm.
suppression, and that's absolutely understandable. um, and it's the main driver still at work today.
Yeah, it is.
And that's why the adherence to the Celtic label persists within the British indigenous groups.
Yeah, and it is cultural appropriation in my opinion actually, because and I even feel that through my exploration into trying to belong in Wales, but going to books like The White Goddess and all these stories of the misconceptions around Celtic spirituality, I was culturally appropriating my own culture. It's really strange that because I was not intentionally, obviously. I think even within the New Age movement, when people are using sage without being informed about it and things, cultural appropriation isn't some kind of malicious, intentional thing that people do. It's a part of the journey to belong, and like releasing the ego and the ignorance is a part of the spiritual path. And yeah, it's yeah, so the in that video that I shared the Iron Age map, that was a video I was talking about animism, and within that video, which leads on to the next question, where there are similarities between the ancient peoples. I shared a video on animism, and I have my own understanding of what animism is based on my research into it and anthropological perspective on what the indigenous peoples of the old world and indigenous peoples today, how they perceive the world around them spiritually. But animism is something I think you could probably describe in a way that's better than me than I could. So what is animism, and does that have anything to do with the people of Pretani in the past?
Okay, again, another big question. So
Yeah.
I'll do my best to keep it clear and succinct. So I guess animism can be defined as a holistic belief system. And within that belief system, it asserts the existence of a spiritual essence, and anima is a Latin word, within a vast array of natural entities. Okay, so these entities can range from living beings like humans, animals, plants, to apparently inanimate objects like rocks, mountains, rivers, celestial bodies, and now even modern technology like cars and computers. Excuse me. And it's rooted in this fundamental idea of interconnectedness. And animism proposes that all things possess an innate consciousness, intentionality, and personhood that can parallel the human experience. Okay, so at its core, animism can suggest that the world's not divided into distinct categories of living and non-living entities, but rather is like a complex web of spiritual energies, each experiencing varying levels of sentience. Yeah, every entity, regardless of its apparent complexity or simplicity, is perceived as having its own unique spiritual identity, its own purpose, its own role in the broader cosmic order. And so this essence isn't limited to ideas like human ideas of soul, but instead represents a much larger spectrum of spiritual manifestations, many of which we may not be able to understand. The animistic belief systems view nature as this dynamic and sentient realm, populated by a multitude of spiritual forces and beings. The entities are attributed with the ability to influence events, affect human affairs, and interact with each other. So, as a result of that, this like a broad assortment of rituals and ceremonies and practices have evolved over time, designed to establish and maintain harmonious and reciprocal relationships and friendships with these entities. And these practices are deeply entwined with cultural narratives, oral traditions, surviving myths, which can provide this framework for understanding the origins of the world, the relationship between the different species, and the ethical principles guiding human behavior. Okay, so we do have an idea that the Pretani practiced animism, and it's supported by a combination of archaeological and historical and anthropological evidence. So I'm going to offer a summary of the evidence, if you like, what we have, which suggests animistic belief amongst the ancient Britons. So the first thing is the burial practices. So the archaeological evidence reveals burial practices that suggest a belief in an afterlife or spiritual realm. So you have these grave assemblages, offerings, rituals associated with burials, implying this belief that there is a continuation of the individual's essence beyond death. And I do believe Julius Caesar, might have been Caesar, noted, or was it Tacitus? I can't remember which one of them noted that the Druids preached the philosophy of reincarnation. So then that is what the at least the continental Celts believed, that we had this continuation of our consciousness. We also have the depiction of animals and symbols. So you'll see lots of British ancient artifacts, Bronze Age, Iron Age, which feature images of animals and plants, and sometimes the two intertwining, suggesting this kind of connection between the human and spiritual worlds. And these depictions can be found among art, they're found on pottery, they're found in weapons and jewelry. And then obviously a big one is the sacred sites and landscapes. So you have these sacred sites that's like stone circles that you see dotted all over, Neolithic stone circles. You've got burial mounds, burial chambers, and certain natural formations were like waters, rivers, were believed to have held spiritual significance for the ancient Britons and their Neolithic predecessors. And it's interesting you talking about having lost, some of the old names for the rivers. I know there's one in the north of England, a water goddess called Coventina, which is an old Romano-Celtic name, but the actual name itself has cognates in Irish Gaelic, and what it actually means is fading memory. And I love that as a name for a river, fading memory. It's like, because sometimes, animistically I can stand with a river and I give some painful memories to the river to take away, and that was just something that I did instinctively. And just to have that wee bit of evidence, sort of, it's a lovely thing.
Yeah, so it's not the name of a goddess, but today people like to name things as goddesses, and you might find in a book that river was associated with a goddess, similar to Dyfrdwy, which is a river up in North Wales, which translates to the sacred water or the divine river or the divine flow. So because I've been trying to find specific goddesses and deities and spirits related to rivers based on the old tongue, and they don't seem to have like this is the name of a goddess, but there is a divine association with the waters. So I totally get what you're saying.
I think this whole thing around deifying various sacred places comes from the Romans, what they call interpretatio Romano. So it's like the Romans saw similarities between their own gods and goddesses as some of the spirits of the land. And so they sort of like imposed their sort of interpretation on to the indigenous British spirits. And this is how you end up with these names. Because Coventina was a Romano-British deity. She was a goddess, and there is like a shrine, but it's a Roman shrine because the Britons didn't use iconography for their sacred places. So it was like it's more accurate to perhaps think in terms for the Britons as seeing places just being alive, or you may have spirit of place, spirit of water, but any names that they ascribed to it would have been epithets. They would have been more descriptors, as you've pointed out, the sacred river, rather than actual names of the beings themselves.
Yeah. And with my perspective on animism comes from my own psychedelic experiences. And I know we didn't say that we were going to go into this, so you don't have to if you don't want to, but for me, the reason that I believe the Pretani were animistic was because we have a psilocybin mushroom here that grows all over these lands. And when I have experienced this psilocybin mushroom, it taught me animism before I even knew what that word animism meant. So for me, it makes sense that if the people of the place were eating those mushrooms and the spirits of the mushroom, even the spirits of the mushroom, as soon as for me I had an experience with them, I met their spirit. So that is animism in itself. That to me teaches me that they likely did, or at least the people who ate the mushrooms. So that's just my own experience, and my link between the people of the ancient people of this land and why they might have been animistic. And I also want to say that it's not like some sort of religion that people used to practice in the past. It is our way of describing it, based on our projection in a sense. But for me, animism is like the baseline or innate belief system within humans. But it's not like, because you said it's about us kind of like personifying aspects of nature in a sense. Like we're using our experience of our consciousness to kind of project onto the natural world. So it's like, is animism directly associated with humans, our perspective on spirit as humans? Does it seem like that's kind of what you were saying? Or is it that it's spirit in general? Like, so like within the Native American cultures, their way of using the word spirit isn't to describe a human spirit within a plant. But it seems like maybe that's what animism is more. Because I'm like trying to figure out what it really means.
Yeah, and it's very complicated, but for me it's about recognizing the innate spirit in everything, and that is also that's not, projecting anthropomorphic personifications onto a plant spirit, otherwise not humanizing things.
Okay.
But respecting them as individual persons that can be communicated with. How that communication happens can be different for the individual. So there isn't any particular set of rules or guidelines about how we should practice. But we, kind of look at ancient cultures as the guide us, and basically all, the archaeology of the ancient Britons ties in very, very beautifully with, current animistic ideas among indigenous populations. So for me, it's about just going and experiencing. And yes, you're right, absolutely right, using the visionary plants. And lots of people say, oh well, there wasn't any evidence that the Britons used mushrooms. And to that I say, oh come on, of course they did. Every culture has used them, and it's like we look at other visionary plant remains that have been found in archaeology, and we know that they used some quite dangerous plants like henbane, for example. Some of the nightshades, they were used. So, but unfortunately, mushrooms are so sort of delicate, so that you're highly unlikely to find any leftovers of that kind of behavior.
Mm. Yeah, to find those leftovers, that it's a whole experiment that there's got to be done. It's got to be deep. It's got to be deeply funded and deeply researched. And there are reasons as to
Mm-hmm.
why psychedelics, even today, in our world today, are only just getting that funding and research. So it's very unlikely that anyone's going to go and do this huge study to find out if the Welsh people, worked with these mushrooms, and then to even understand how they did or what their connection was is another thing entirely. But all of this is like, this whole conversation that we're having is on, for me, there's like two sides of it. There's we've got the evidence and the lack of evidence to understand the history here, and then we've got the personal journey that we are taking today in the modern world. And both of these, I feel that everyone listening to this podcast, we all share a similar intention, and that is to harmonize as you said, it's an animistic sense, to harmonize with the earth again, so that it's no longer, you know, it's no longer afraid of us, in a sense, because I think the animistic worldview would be very apparent if the spirits within the world were not afraid of us. And I think we have really treated the natural world awfully, for quite a while. And that's why it's really hard to believe that to see this unless you have some sort of spiritual awakening through the mushrooms, in my experience, because they're just not speaking to us anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But if we listen, yeah, and if we listen, they will speak to us, and we don't actually need to look at the history in order for that to happen. But that's what this podcast is about, and that's what people are asking me about, and that's what me and you are obviously really interested in, and it is helping us to belong, I feel, and yeah, connect. But it's not necessary, because we are here right now. The earth has not changed. Well, the earth has changed, but like the seasons are still cycling. The plants are still there to be spoken to. I'm looking right now out of my window at the fields, and it's very managed, because here in Britain we like to like organize and control things, and we like it all to be in a specific way. But you can still go out into the ancient woodlands that are left, and find meaning and purpose and practice there that is individual to you, based on what you want to do today, and how are you going to bring that into your community? How are you going to show your friends, by leading by example, how they can live harmoniously with the earth again? You don't have to have all of this historical knowledge and wisdom, because I don't, but I'm being a bridge knight right now for people who are listening to this podcast that want to learn about how they can connect to the earth in indigenous ways, with people who have expertise on perhaps how we did in the past. So this Zoom call has got about 5 minutes left. So if you'd like to just share any kind of roundups on anything we've said, or if you'd like to talk about some of the courses and workshops that you've got going on this year, one of which is very close to me, so I'm going to be attending that, and I'm sure people would like to as well. So what have you got going on?
Well, at the moment, I'm writing a book, and I've been researching and working with an old Irish myth, which basically seems to function as a medicine wheel. Bizarrely enough, it functions beautifully as a medicine wheel. I've put some stuff up on Instagram about the meanings of the four directions in the center. So my workshop is called The Medicine of the Four Directions, a journey into Old Irish cosmology. And it's basically working with the attributes given to the four directions in an old Irish myth called the settling of the manor at Tara. And in that story, an otherworldly visitor comes and describes the attributes of the four directions in the center. And he gives those as: the west is knowledge, north is battle, east is prosperity, south is music, and the center is sovereignty. And so basically my weekends are a deep dive into what those attributes mean for a human life cycle, for the human experience, and how we can bring that old wisdom, which is probably around 1500 years old, bang up to date for a modern 21st century existence. And it sort of encompasses a lot of animistic principles and some of the historical information that is useful in order to bring the wisdom forward. So that is happening in Caerphilly at the Sanctum community. That we can put some details up on YouTube, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll put the link to, is it book-in? Do people book in online and they get their tickets online? Yeah, I'll put that link if anyone would like to come along. And yeah, there's more. I'll obviously link your website, the Pretani Wisdom Traditions website. There's a lot more on there, different online courses and whatnot. And we were saying off this recording that this is the beginning of something so beautiful and also so scary, because there will be a lot of ignorance. Resistance is a lot of resistance, but that is a part of the journey. That is a part of the spiritual journey, is to overcome that and remember that we are interconnected with the natural world around us. And the less we resist, the more we can just surrender into that and flow into that. And yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for having a chat with me. I'll see you at I'll see you in Philly. When is that again? Sorry, when is it?
Oh God, he put me on the spot. Just a minute. Sorry, I should have prepared that.
No, it's okay. I've sent it to my friend earlier. It is on the 7th of April, the 6th and the 7th
That's it.
of
Thank
April.
you.
Yeah. So yeah, yeah, so this course is a 2-day workshop and it's on the 6th and the 7th of April. And I'd love to see anyone listening to this there so we can connect in person and build some sort of more in real life community because I'm loving the online community right now, but it would be awesome to see us all together and share what we know and what we're planning. So yeah, thank you so much, Sam. It's been such an awesome conversation.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Right, bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Yeah, I went.